As a new Unreal Engine 5 first-person shooter developed for PlayStation 5, Xbox Series consoles, and PC, the finals released quite suddenly in late 2023. After a smattering of previews and an open beta, the complete game stealth launched to the public in a free-to-play form, and it's surprisingly great. There's a bit of context to the finals though, and in particular the developer behind it. Developed by Embark Studios, a Stockholm-based team comprised of former DICE veterans, the standout feature of the finals is its destruction physics. It's in the way buildings crumble through, in how a C4 blast procedurally blows out a chunk of the terrain, how RPG-7s blast through floors, ceilings brick by brick, and it's even possible to level entire structures with enough firepower, if you choose to anyway. The default goal of its quick cash mode is rather simple. 3 teams of 3 chase after money in a bid to bring it back to their vault. Essentially, follow the yellow marker and you're probably on the right path. But it's this interplay with physics destruction that gives the finals its unique edge. In a similar vein to DICE's Battlefield series, notably Bad Company 1 and 2, it means any contested area becomes a chaotic war zone. You're able to carve out holes in the environment to your advantage by charging at walls or using explosives, and by the end of a match, the terrain is often completely transformed into a sea of concrete debris and flames. This destruction physics focus is the final's main draw then. It's the big sell. Add in the ability to set areas aflame, or even add new partitions using this so-called goo gun, and there are plenty of ways to manipulate the space. But each map, from the glitz of the Vegas casinos to the high rises of Seoul, are also impressively realized on Unreal Engine 5, before you lay waste to them anyway. Now, while going for heavy artillery is of course the most immediately attractive thing to try, the design of these maps does also reward agile platforming. The Skyway Stadium, for example, is a real standout in this sense. Presenting as a kind of utopian arena built around conjoined rooftops, there's a Mirror's Edge-esque aesthetic to it, a design language. There are props to help you get to the payload quickly all round. Bridges, jump pads, and zip lines, all color-coded in saturated yellows and reds. And given that most maps scale vertically too, adding to their complexity, keeping these elements legible helps massively in picking a route. Beyond that, the game's 3 core class types, light, medium, and heavy, also each take huge advantage of each map. The light build is quick, ideal for transporting payloads. It's able to crawl through ducts, turn invisible for a brief spell, use grappling hooks, or even set explosives to break through walls. The medium class, meanwhile, is more of a healer type. You're able to set up turrets, plant jump pads, or use healing beams on allies. And lastly, the most compelling class type, perhaps, is the heavy type. The destructive potential here is pretty huge, with a default ability to charge through walls, use an RPG-7, or set up barricades for your allies. Regardless of your chosen class type though, it's just satisfying to cave in a ceiling just to disrupt the enemy position, or better yet, blast through enough of the foundations of a building to make it crumble into a heap of rubble. All round then, Embark Studios has done a great job of giving each class a set of abilities that feel relevant to each map and the game's physics, plus add in the different weather states for snow, sandstorms, and fog, and there's plenty of visual variety too. Okay, before we get to the comparisons, the finals has one extra trick up its sleeve on console. Ray tracing is included here on PS5, Xbox Series X and S with an RTX GI technique in line with the PC version. As Alex Battaglia has covered in his own PC analysis of the finals, this is a probe-based ray trace global illumination method helping to create more realistic ambient lighting. It stands out best in interiors, I think, and so often you'll see light spilling through loft windows with light bounces brightening a room's corners. And once you blast a hole in that wall, the light bounces react in a realistic way to further brighten the space. All of this ray-traced GI logic is maintained on console, except, and as Alex has covered in his own video, it runs at a lower setting compared to PC. Here's a great example of where PS5 stands by comparison. The crucial bit is the time it takes to reflect the light bounce calculation after any destruction has taken place. Sometimes it takes 10 to 20 seconds to adjust on PS5, which is quite a delay compared to even PC's low setting. With all of that in mind, how do the PS5, Series X, and S compare? All consoles target 60 frames per second in the finals, which is great news. Also, there's no quality or performance mode toggle on any console, as is the trend for many games these days. The finals simply guns for 60 FPS out of the box as the default setup, and that's it. It's optimized purely for this one way to play, but to be blunt, the focus for this comparison really is on Series S, knowing very well that it's the machine with the least GPU power on tap. So first up, we see a drop to its native resolution. On PS5 and Series X, we get a matching 1440p to 4K range. A form of temporal upsampling is used to hit a 4K target, essentially, but that's with dynamic resolution scaling, allowing for a range of values in between based on GPU load. In truth, it's very uncommon for either machine to reach that maximum 4K, though it is possible by looking directly up at the sky. Meanwhile, Series S takes a visible hit. You get a range of 720p up to 1512p instead here, which is a noticeable dip in image quality. Again, that upper bounds 1512p figure comes in during very rare, non-GPU taxing moments, but for general play, it rests at numbers in between, and the result is inevitably a less crisp image than the sibling Series X and PS5. Between PS5 and Series X, we're at a stalemate of sorts in terms of visual features. Textures, effects, shadow quality, and even the quality of its RTX GI are a direct match between the two. They hit the same standard. Again though, the cutbacks on Series S are more notable, so let's hone in on just the Series S and X for clarity. To start, Series S drops foliage density across the ground, which means in the training area you'll see grass detail is dropped to preset, creating sparser points on the ground. Really, it's a minor detail that doesn't show in motion. More of an issue though is that texture filtering is dropped a level too. The result being ground textures are less defined at oblique angles, the kind of angle you typically view the ground from in any first-person shooter. Even if the texture asset is the same between Series S and X, this combination of lower anisotropic filtering plus the lower resolution 720p to 1440p range on Series S ends up blurring a surface's details. Next along, in terms of shadows, we do see a more sizable difference. For any up-close detail on sun-cast shadows, Series S uses a lower preset, causing more visible flickering on movement. It's a subtle difference, but slowing the footage down, it's clear there's more visual noise, more breakup on the character and tree shadows. And in a similar vein, Series S also falls short in shadow filtering. So to isolate on Series S, for example, there's an obvious filtering line on shadows ahead as we run through the stage. This cascade line is nearer to the camera on Series S, simply put, making the quality switch all the more glaring. And likewise, draw distances on geometry are reined in on Series S too, so expect to catch more pop-in overall on the 4 teraflop machine during any quick sprints across the map. Between the resolution cutbacks, the drop in foliage detail, shadow quality, and geometry draw distances, Series S still looks and plays well. And so, on that note, let's get to performance testing on Series S first then. There's a visual sacrifice, clearly, especially in image quality when it hits that 720p lower bounds, but the end result really justifies the means, I think. For a competitive multiplayer shooter in this tradition, Embark Studios clearly respects the need to optimize for 60 FPS. And so, impressively, the team does manage to hit a typically locked 60 frames per second even during peak action. You're able to charge through entire buildings, you're able to set forests aflame, or build new partitions using the goo grenade. Cause as much havoc and wreckage as you like. It's difficult to buckle the reading on Series S in my experience, so far at least. The UE5 technology working with dynamic resolution scaling appears to adjust accordingly with the GPU load to hand in a mostly tight 60 FPS. I say mostly because there's always the potential for drops. On Series S, for example, there's a pretty surefire way to trigger a lurch below 60 FPS if you're truly determined to. So, take any overview of a stage from the rooftops, any complex area will do. Next, raise and lower your viewpoint aggressively, look to the sky, Give the engine time to raise the resolution to closer to 1512p, and then sharply drop your viewpoint. In this brief moment, the engine will try to adjust the resolution to a more suitable value, based on the sudden spike in GPU load, and within that window, we see a drop to the mid-50s, sometimes lower, with full screen tearing too. Series S is the most vulnerable overall to drops like this in its pure GPU side limitation. This is an artificial and extreme condition, obviously, where in actual practical play it's surprisingly uncommon so far. I wouldn't rule out drops into the 50s like this entirely then, but generally the DRS system does well to avoid any noticeable lurches in frame rate on Series S. Next along is of course Series X, which puts in an even more consistent 60fps reading. There's no way to match the Series S in any coordinated test, really. The best approach is to simply throw hours at the game and see if any frame rate drops appear in the general run of play. Based on 5 hours of testing then, in using every class and every explosive weapon available to me so far, Series X turns in a watertight 60fps, 99% of the time at least. Across the Vegas map, the Soul stage, there are only rare moments that show any real issue. At worst, alpha transparency effects like fire trigger a brief flash of tearing up and down the entire screen, with a brief drop into the 50s. Also, certain moments with physics-based destruction cue a similar drop, but nothing too egregious overall. Honestly, it's all too easy to show a collection of all the worst moments from hours of play. The truth is, the bulk of my time spent playing on Series X was met with a flat 60fps line, as dull as that is to show. Great news, and again, all credit to Embark Studios for optimizing realistically to the console's abilities. Last up, of course, is the PlayStation 5 version, which, much like Series X, has no problem hitting 60fps most of the time. Across every stage, it's typically a consistent performer. It must be said, though, where drops do occur in my testing on PS5, they tend to drop much harder than Series X. They drop for longer stretches. It might be simply down to bad luck in stumbling across the worst scenarios possible in such a dynamic physics-based game. There really is no matched test method between PS5 and Series X here after all to simulate the same load on each. But based on another 5-hour sample of gameplay, I couldn't help but notice heavy destruction physics and alpha effects trigger drops into the 50s on PS5 more typically. These drops also do not resolve back to 60fps quickly as they do on Series X. In the current build at least, they tend to linger for as long as you keep the destruction in view. It must be stressed that this shows PS5 at its rare worst moments, because otherwise it hands in an identical performance level to Series X. There's anecdotal evidence here then to suggest PS5 is prone to bigger drops in its current state, which I hope are easy to address, but that's the state of the finals as it stands right now. As a free-to-play game, it genuinely surprised me with how robust the mechanics are, with how successfully it commits to its physics destruction. The concept really worked brilliantly. The only complaint I have, really, is the default look of your characters. This goes back to its free-to-play design, and Embark Studios, in fairness, does need to make money somehow from this project, and so the cosmetic changes to your character must be paid for in real-life currency. As a result, you're kind of stuck with a rather bland default costume until you pay up. I think that's a fair trade though, honestly, especially given all the weapons and skills are unlockable without spending a penny. The mechanics of its gameplay are unaffected, and the pure joy of playing the finals is open to anyone. In assessing PS5, Series X and S versions today, it's a real pleasure to say no console loses out on 60fps gameplay. You get the destruction physics, the RT global illumination on each machine, and sparing some visual cutbacks on Series S in resolution, foliage, and shadows, they each offer a superb way to play the game. The finals had that stealthy late 2023 release, and if you happen to miss it, I'd highly recommend giving it a go. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.